I never wrote that letter, Julian. I came to your penthouse. I stood in the freezing rain and begged your assistant to let me see you. And your fiancé handed me an envelope, looked me dead in the eye, and told me I was a complication you could not afford. You are lying. I wish I were. But those two boys eating clover on your $40 million lawn have your eyes, Julian, your grandfather's eyes. And they have been hungry while you signed $5 billion deals in a glass tower less than a mile from where they sleep. If you are watching this right now, I need you to stop whatever you are doing. Put down your phone, close the other tabs, because the story I am about to tell you is going to break your heart, put it back together, and change the way you think about everything you believe matters in this life. This is a story about a man who had the entire world at his feet and did not realize he was standing on the grave of his own happiness. And it starts on a cold gray morning on the coast of Washington State, where a billionaire stepped outside to have his photograph taken for a magazine cover and instead found two starving children eating weeds in his garden. Before I take you there, I want to ask you something. Have you ever made a decision you thought was right at the time, only to realize years later that it cost you everything that actually mattered? Most of us carry regrets. Quiet ones, the kind we push down when the house gets too quiet at night. But what if your biggest regret was not a missed opportunity or a failed investment? What if your biggest regret was a pair of living, breathing human beings who walked around with your face, your laugh, your DNA, and you did not even know they existed? That is exactly what happened to Julian Vance. And by the end of this story, he will lose his fiancée, his company, and nearly his mind. But he will gain something no amount of money on this earth can buy. And the secret hidden inside a hand-carved wooden pendant around one little boy's neck will change everything. If you believe that family is worth more than any bank account, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to Billionaire Love Stories with Mr. Brad, and drop a comment telling me what is the one thing in your life that money could never replace. I read every single comment, and your story might just inspire the next one I tell. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The morning mist rolling off Puget Sound smelled of crushed pine needles, cold salt water, and incoming rain. It was the kind of gray, heavy Pacific Northwest morning that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Julian Vance stood on the cantilevered terrace of his glass and cedar estate at Heron's Point, adjusting the platinum cufflinks of his bespoke charcoal suit. He was 36 years old, and according to every financial publication on the planet, he was the youngest maritime logistics titan in North America. His company, Vance Maritime, controlled nearly 30% of all Pacific shipping lanes. He had homes in Seattle, Tokyo, and London. He had a private jet, a fleet of luxury vehicles, and a net worth that most people could not pronounce. And yet, as he stood there staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, the only personal item in his entire house was a faded photograph of his late grandfather sitting on the nightstand upstairs. Everything else was curated. Everything else was cold. Everything else was perfect in the way that a museum is perfect. Beautiful to look at, but you would never want to live inside it. Inside the cavernous living room behind him, Cordelia Sterling was inspecting the catering arrangements for that evening's pre-wedding gala. Cordelia was the daughter of one of New England's oldest banking dynasties, and she carried that legacy in every gesture, every word, every carefully calculated smile. Her silver blonde hair was pinned in an immaculate chignon. Her silk blouse cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved through the house like a general surveying a battlefield, barking instructions at the event coordinator through a Bluetooth earpiece. "Julian, the photographer arrives in 40 minutes, she called out, without looking up from her tablet. "I need you in the study for the pre-shoot interview. And please, for the love of God, do not wear the navy tie. It photographs terribly against the cedar walls." Julian did not respond. He was staring down toward the eastern perimeter of the property, where the manicured velvet turf gave way to a secluded Japanese moss and botanical garden. Something was moving down there. Something small. He squinted through the mist. Two figures, kneeling in the damp earth. "Cordelia," he said slowly, "who authorized visitors on the grounds today?" Cordelia finally looked up, following his gaze toward the garden. Her expression did not change. She took a delicate sip from a fluted glass of vintage sparkling cider and shrugged. "Oh, do not mind them, Julian. They are just strays from the old cannery docks down the bluff. They slipped through the hedge about 20 minutes ago, crying about not having breakfast. I told them if their mother could not be bothered to feed them, the lawn was free for grazing." Julian turned to look at the woman he was scheduled to marry in 12 days. Her smile never wavered. She took another slow, deliberate sip from her glass as though she were commenting on the weather. A strange cold sensation prickled the back of Julian's neck. He did not say another word to her. He simply turned and walked swiftly across the damp lawn toward the garden, his $12,000 Italian leather shoes sinking into the wet grass with every step. As he got closer, the shapes resolved into clarity. They were two small boys, identical in every way, perhaps 5 years old. They wore oversized, faded wool cardigans that hung past their wrists and worn canvas sneakers with holes in the toes. Their dark curls were plastered against their foreheads by the morning dew. And they were not playing. They were hunched over a patch of wild clover and sweet sorrel, pulling the green leaves from the soil with their small, dirt-caked fingers and putting them directly into their mouths. "Hey," Julian said, his voice dropping instinctively as he approached. "Do not eat that. It is covered in fertilizer and rain runoff." The two boys froze. Together, in perfect unison, they looked up. Julian's breath hitched in his chest like a fishhook catching on bone. They had identical heart-shaped faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but it was their eyes that stopped his heart. Deep oceanic slate gray, ringed with a distinct sunburst halo of golden amber at the center. It was a genetic anomaly so rare that in Julian's family it had appeared only twice in 2 centuries. First in his great-grandfather, the founder of Vance Maritime, and then in Julian himself. He saw those eyes in the mirror every single morning, and now he was staring into 4 of them, looking up at him from the wet clover on his $40 million lawn. Julian dropped to both knees. He did not care about the suit. He did not care about the photographer waiting by the pool. He did not care about the $5 billion consortium deal closing tomorrow afternoon. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. "What are your names?" he whispered, his voice trembling in a way none of his board members had ever heard. The boy on the left, slightly taller with a small scrape across his chin, sat back on his heels and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "I am Arthur. This is Felix." Felix, the quieter of the two, drew closer to his brother, clutching a battered plastic toy lighthouse in his small hands. As Felix shifted, a cord slipped from beneath the collar of his cardigan. Dangling from the fraying leather string was a small hand-carved pendant made of red cedar driftwood. Etched into the polished grain was an intricate nautical compass rose, and in the center were 6 precise coordinates: 47 degrees, 36 minutes north, 122 degrees, 20 minutes west. Julian stared at the carving. His vision blurred. His hands began to shake. He had carved that pendant himself with a pocket knife 6 years ago, sitting on a storm-lashed beach in the San Juan Islands, during the only 3 months of his life when he had forgotten about quarterly earnings, stock options, and the crushing expectations of his family name. He had given it to a brilliant, fierce Marine archivist named Sienna Ward, the woman who had looked into his soul, seen the lonely boy behind the corporate armor, and loved him anyway. The woman he had allowed his board of directors to fire and silence with a ruthless non-disclosure agreement the moment she whispered that their lives were about to become complicated. "Where did you get this?" Julian asked, his voice cracking as his fingers gently hovered near the wooden pendant. "Our mama made it," Felix murmured, his amber-flecked eyes searching Julian's face with innocent curiosity. "She said it is a map to where she left her heart." "Where is your mama, Arthur?" Julian asked. The world around him had ceased to exist. The noise of the photographers, the wind in the pines, the distant hum of the catering trucks. All of it was gone. Arthur pointed past the tall iron security gate, down the winding cliffside path toward the fog-drenched cove of Old Harbor. "At the bait shop. She works the counter in the morning and mends the crab nets at noon. Miss Higgins was supposed to watch us, but her hip went out." "Julian," Cordelia's voice sliced through the air from the terrace above, "the photographer is waiting. We have the final seating arrangement call with the caterer at noon. Send them away and come inside." Julian stood up slowly. He looked back at Cordelia standing on the terrace, glittering, composed, and completely devoid of warmth. Then he looked down at Arthur and Felix, who were looking at him with his own eyes, shivering in the damp Pacific chill. "Tell the photographer to pack up," Julian said without turning around. "Excuse me?" Cordelia's tone sharpened with disbelief. "We are scheduled for the national cover story." "I said cancel it," Julian commanded, his voice dropping into a register of cold steel that made the event coordinator freeze mid-step. He extended both hands to the boys. "Come on, I am taking you home." The walk down the coastal ridge to Old Harbor was less than a mile, yet it felt like traversing an abyss between 2 separate universes. On the ridge stood the glass monuments of tech and logistics wealth, gated estates with manicured grounds, heated driveways, and security cameras on every corner. Below, nestled in the damp shadows of the cliffs, was the working-class soul of the bay, Weather-beaten cedar shacks, rusted boat trailers, and clotheslines heavy with wool sweaters drying in the salty air. Arthur held Julian's left hand tightly, babbling with uninhibited curiosity about the giant blue heron they spotted near the tidal flats. Felix walked quietly on his right, his small warm hand resting securely in Julian's palm, occasionally looking up at Julian's face with a quiet, contemplative gaze that pierced Julian to the marrow. "Do you live in that giant glass box up there?" Arthur asked, looking back up the hill. "I do," Julian replied. "Why is it so big?" Felix asked softly. "Do you have 50 dogs?" "No," Julian said, the word catching in his throat. "No dogs. Just me." "That must be very quiet," Felix noted with the solemn wisdom unique to children who have learned to observe more than they speak. "Mama says when a house is too quiet, it forgets how to laugh." Julian could not answer. Every step down the cracked asphalt felt like a reckoning. The fog thickened around them as they descended, wrapping the three of them in a cocoon of gray mist and the sound of distant foghorns. They reached a tiny salt-bleached cottage perched on cedar pilings near the public docks. A rusted bicycle with a child's seat sat by the porch. The front door was slightly ajar, and from inside came the frantic sound of someone moving furniture, accompanied by a voice laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Arthur? Felix? Please, God, no!" The door flew open. Sienna Ward stood on the threshold. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a hurried knot, strands falling loose around her pale, sweat-sheened face. She was wearing a worn navy work shirt splattered with brine and faded denim jeans. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the door frame. When her eyes landed on the twins, a sob tore from her throat. "Arthur! Felix! Where did you go? I turned around for 2 minutes and you were gone." "I have been searching the entire dock." Then her gaze lifted, and she froze. The color drained completely from her face. Her gray-gold eyes, the exact twin to the eyes Julian had been looking into for the past half hour, widened in pure, paralyzed shock. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the air itself had turned to water. "Julian," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like an ancient buried secret that had been clawing its way to the surface for 6 long years. "Sienna," Julian said. His voice was barely a breath. Sienna's reaction was instantaneous. The relief of finding her children vanished, replaced by an incandescent protective fury that radiated from her entire body. She lunged forward, pulling Arthur and Felix behind her, sheltering them with her body like a lioness shielding her cubs from a predator. "Get off my porch," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "Get away from them." "Sienna, wait. No, you do not get to come here. You do not get to look at them." Tears of sheer panic and humiliation sprang into her eyes. "You have your empire, Julian. You had your lawyers threaten me with ruin if I ever set foot within 10 miles of your family's foundation. What are you doing with my sons?" "Our sons," Julian said, the truth tearing out of him before he could soften the blow. "Sienna, they have my eyes. They have my grandfather's compass. Look at them." "They are my sons," Sienna choked out, her knuckles whitening as she held the boy's shoulders. "I carried them alone. I delivered them alone in a county clinic, while your face was on the front page of every paper for buying out Pacific Rail. I worked 16 hours a day cleaning fish and filing shipping logs so they would not freeze in the winter. You gave up any claim to them 6 years ago when you had your security escort me out of the building." Julian felt as if the ground beneath him had sheared away. "You told me you were pregnant, and 48 hours later your desk was cleared. I received a letter from your personal email stating you had taken the settlement money and terminated the pregnancy because it did not fit your plans." Sienna stared at him, her lips parting in horror. "What? I never wrote that." "I came to your penthouse. I begged your assistant to let me see you. Cordelia was there. She told me you had already signed the injunction. She gave me an envelope with 3 months' salary and said if I did not leave the state, you would use your legal team to ensure I never worked in maritime research again." The world turned red at the edges of Julian's vision. The pieces rearranged themselves in his mind with terrifying clarity. 6 years ago, when his father had suffered his fatal stroke, Julian had been thrust into the CEO position amid an aggressive corporate coup. He had been drowning in board warfare, vulnerable, trusting the Sterling family's political machinery to keep the firm afloat. Cordelia had stepped in to manage his personal affairs, and she had managed them with a precision that now looked less like loyalty and more like sabotage. "I did not know, Sienna," Julian said, his voice breaking. "On my father's grave, on everything I have ever built or ever will build, I did not know they existed. I thought you had chosen to walk away from me. Would it have made a difference if you knew?" Sienna demanded, her voice cracking as a single tear escaped down her cheek. Be honest, Julian. 6 years ago, when you were clawing your way to the top of Vance Maritime, would you have chosen 2 screaming babies and a disgraced archivist over your father's empire? Julian looked at her, at the exhaustion etched around her beautiful, fierce eyes, at the faded cuffs of her work shirt, at his 2 sons peeking out from behind her legs with wide, frightened eyes. He had no defense. 6 years ago, he had been a creature of pure ambition, hollowed out by fear of failure. No, Julian whispered with devastating honesty. 6 years ago, I was too blind and too cowardly to deserve them. Or you. But I am looking at them now, Sienna. They were eating clover in my garden because they were hungry. My flesh and blood, I will not walk away from this. We do not want your guilt money, Julian, Sienna said, her voice dropping into a weary, defensive whisper. We have survived without you. We will continue to survive. Mama, Arthur piped up, tugging her sleeve. He walked us all the way down the big hill. He did not let us fall on the rocks. Sienna swallowed hard, looking down at her son, her resolve battling against the crushing weight of her exhaustion. Julian pulled a small plain silver pen and a notebook from his breast pocket. He wrote a single number on the page, tore it out, and placed it gently on the wooden railing of the porch. I will not force my way into this house today, Julian said quietly, but I will not disappear. I am going to make this right, Sienna, whatever it takes. He turned and walked back up the hill alone. As he reached the gate, he heard Arthur's small voice drift through the fog from inside the cottage. Mama, is that man the one who carved your compass? The door closed. Julian stood alone on the cliffside, the mist rolling in around him, his entire worldview in ruins. Julian Vance drove back up the hill to his glass fortress, but for the first time in his life, the view from the top felt like a prison. That night, Julian did not attend the board dinner. He did not answer the 17 calls from Cordelia. He did not respond to the urgent messages from Derek Caldwell, his senior managing director and Cordelia's uncle, demanding to know why the magazine shoot had been canceled. Instead, he sat alone in his darkened study at Heron's Point, the glass walls reflecting only his solitary silhouette against the pitch-black waters of the Sound. On the mahogany desk sat his laptop, and on the screen were 6 years of archived emails, bank records, and legal documents that he was tearing apart with the obsessive precision of a man who had just realized his entire life was built on a lie. At 2 a.m, he found it. The email confirming Sienna's resignation, the one he had received 6 years ago and accepted without question, had originated from an IP address registered to the Sterling family's estate in Newport, Rhode Island. Not from Sienna's apartment, not from her phone, from Cordelia's family home. And the severance payment, the one Julian believed he had authorized, had been drawn from a private discretionary account controlled not by him, but by Derek Caldwell. Julian stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. The weight of 6 stolen years crashed down on him like a collapsing building. He opened Sienna's public social media profile and scrolled through years of photographs he should have been in. Birthday parties with homemade cakes shaped like lighthouses. First day of school with matching outfits that were clearly sewn by hand. Halloween costumes made from recycled fishing nets. Every milestone he had missed, every first step, every first word, every feverish night spent comforting a crying child, all of it gone, erased by a forged email and a woman who smiled at him over champagne while his sons ate grass on his lawn. A sharp tap on the door broke the silence. Cordelia walked in, dressed in a sweeping emerald silk evening gown, her expression tight with exasperation. The catering staff is dismissed, and half the city's elite think you suffered a nervous breakdown, she said, crossing her arms. Derek has been fielding calls from the consortium members for 3 hours. What on earth happened to you today? Julian did not look up from the screen. Who gave the order to forge Sienna Ward's resignation 6 years ago, Cordelia? The room became instantly, suffocatingly quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes an earthquake. Cordelia did not flinch, but her eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits. I have no idea what you are talking about. Derek's signature is on the wire transfer, Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. And the IP address that sent the termination email came from your family's house. You made her disappear. You told her I had signed an injunction against her. You told her to terminate the pregnancy. Cordelia let out a short, contemptuous laugh. She walked over to the desk, resting her slender hands on the polished wood, and looked down at Julian with an expression of absolute terrifying composure. And what if I did? Look at where you are today, Julian. You are on the verge of controlling the largest maritime shipping network on the globe, Do you honestly think you would be here if you had saddled yourself with a low-level archivist and a pair of illegitimate children at 30 years old? I saved you from your own sentimentality." Julian looked at her. For months, he had mistaken her cold ambition for strength, her aristocratic detachment for elegance. Now, looking at her, he saw only a vast, hollow void where a human heart was supposed to be. "They are my sons," Julian said. "They are a PR disaster," she snapped back. "The consortium signs tomorrow afternoon. The Wall Street press is arriving at 3. You will issue a statement declaring that you are providing a private trust for some local charity case. You will marry me next weekend at the cathedral as planned, and you will put an end to this ridiculous melodrama." "Get out," Julian said. Cordelia blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Take your things, leave the ring on the table, and get out of my house." Cordelia's face flushed with ugly, mottled fury. "You would not dare! If you break this engagement, the Sterling banks will withdraw their underwriting for the consortium. Derek will initiate a vote of no confidence with the board. You will lose Vance Maritime by Tuesday morning." Julian stood up. Standing at his full height, the predatory stillness that had made him feared in global boardrooms settled over him like a second skin. "I built this company from my grandfather's dockyards," he whispered. "You and your uncle were just along for the ride. Get out of my house before I have security remove you the same way you removed the mother of my children." When the heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, Julian let out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time in his life, the silence of the massive house did not feel suffocating. It felt like an empty canvas. "If this story is breaking your heart the way it is breaking mine, I need you to do something right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. And if you have not subscribed yet, join the Billionaire Love Stories family right now. We tell stories that matter, stories that remind us what it means to be human. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about someone you trusted? I want to hear your story. Now, let us go back to Julian, because the hardest part of his journey is just beginning. At 6:30 the following morning, Julian Vance did something he had not done in 15 years. He put on a faded cotton flannel shirt, broken-in work boots, and drove his vintage pickup truck down to the Old Harbor docks without a security detail, without an assistant, and without a plan. He found Sienna behind the counter of the bait and tackle shop, sorting wooden floats into wire crates. Her face was pale, dark purple smudges beneath her eyes testifying to a sleepless night. When the bell above the door chimed and she saw him, she froze, her hands hovering over the netting. "I called my lawyers this morning," Julian said, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. "I revoked the non-disclosure agreement. I have initiated legal proceedings to recognize Arthur and Felix as my legitimate heirs, and I ended my engagement with Cordelia last night." Sienna looked at him for a long, silent moment. Her expression was not one of triumph, but of profound, guarded sorrow. She had spent 5 years bracing herself against the world, expecting cruelty and indifference at every turn. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. "Do you think that fixes it, Julian?" she asked softly. "A signature on a piece of paper? Do you think you can just buy your way back into the years you missed? They do not know who you are. To them you are just the man from the big glass box on the hill." "Then teach me," Julian said, stepping forward, his voice cracked with raw, unvarnished humility. "Teach me how to be their father. I do not care about the board. I do not care about the consortium. I missed 5 years of their lives, Sienna. Tell me what to do and I will do it." Sienna looked down at the rough wooden counter, her throat moving as she swallowed back tears. "Arthur has nightmares about the ocean during high storms," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bait tanks. "He needs someone to sit by his bed and tap 3 times on the headboard to remind him the floor is solid. Felix gets ear infections when the wind shifts from the east. He hates taking medicine unless you mix it with strawberry jam." Julian listened as if she were handing him the schematics to his own soul. 3 taps on the headboard. Strawberry jam. What else? "They finish kindergarten at 2 o'clock, Sienna said, looking up, her amber-ringed eyes searching his. "If you are late, Arthur starts biting his fingernails until they bleed because he thinks I have forgotten him." "I will never be late," Julian swore. "Never." For the next 4 weeks, the corporate titan disappeared from the financial pages. Every afternoon at 10 minutes to 2, Julian's truck was parked outside the weather-beaten schoolhouse in Old Harbor. When the doors opened, Arthur and Felix would come running out, their backpacks bouncing. At first they were hesitant, treating him with cautious curiosity. Arthur tested him constantly, demanding he prove he knew which twin was which. Julian learned to tell them apart by tiny details, Arthur had a small scar on his left knee from a fall on the docks. Felix hummed softly to himself when he was concentrating. Julian learned to navigate their world. He sat cross-legged on the worn rug of Sienna's tiny living room, assembling intricate wooden train tracks with Arthur, who had inherited Julian's obsessive spatial intelligence. He read ancient illustrated books about sea monsters to Felix, letting the quiet boy rest his head against his chest until Felix's breathing synchronized with his own. One evening, Arthur looked up from the train tracks and asked the question that nearly destroyed Julian. "Mama says you left because we were too loud. Were we too loud?" Julian's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He pulled Arthur into his arms and held him so tightly the boy squirmed. "You were never too loud," Julian whispered into his son's dark curls. "The world was too quiet without you in the quiet evenings after the boys fell asleep." Julian and Sienna sat on the small wooden porch overlooking the bay, drinking black tea from chipped mugs, slowly speaking the unspoken words of 6 years of grief, misunderstanding, and the enduring embers of a love that had refused to die. "I never stopped looking for your face in the crowds," Julian admitted one evening, his hand resting on the porch rail inches from hers. "Every time I closed a deal, every time I stood in an empty hotel room in Tokyo or London, I kept wondering why none of it felt real." Sienna looked out at the moonlight dancing on the dark waves. "I tried to hate you, Julian. For 5 years, hating you was the only thing that kept me from collapsing under the weight of raising them alone. But whenever Arthur would look at me with your eyes, or Felix would laugh with that quiet, low chuckle of yours, I knew I was lying to myself." Their fingers brushed against the weathered wood. For a moment, the 6 years of separation seemed to dissolve into the salt air, but Sienna pulled back slightly, her expression clouding with worry. "Julian, your world and my world are not the same," she said quietly. "The board, the press, the money. It will crush us if you try to merge them. I have a job offer in Anchorage. It pays better than all 3 of my current jobs combined. If the media finds out about the boys, I will take them and disappear before they can become a headline." Julian felt a surge of terror. "You cannot take them to Alaska." "I survived 5 years without you," Sienna said, her voice hardening. "I can survive the rest of my life if I have to. Those boys are not a publicity opportunity, Julian. They are my entire world, and I will not let your empire destroy them the way it destroyed us the first time." Julian left the cottage that night feeling both desperate and determined. He knew the walls were closing in. The board was growing restless. The consortium deadline was approaching. And somewhere in the shadows, Derek Caldwell was sharpening his knives, waiting for Julian to make a single misstep. But as he drove back up the hill, his phone buzzed with a text from Sienna. It was a photograph. Arthur and Felix, asleep in their shared bed, their dark curls tangled together, their small hands clasped even in sleep. Beneath the photo, Sienna had typed 3 words. "They asked about you." Julian stared at the image until the streetlights blurred into streaks of gold. He pressed the phone against his chest and made a silent vow that no boardroom, no billion-dollar deal, and no storm on this earth would ever separate him from his sons again. But the storm was already coming, and it was going to be worse than anything Julian Vance had ever faced in his entire life. The tabloid photograph hit the internet on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, Julian Vance's carefully constructed double life had exploded into 1,000 irreparable pieces. It started innocently enough. Julian had taken Arthur and Felix to the public docks after school to watch the fishing boats come in. It was a simple outing, the kind of ordinary afternoon that any father might share with his sons. Arthur was perched on Julian's shoulders, pointing excitedly at a pod of harbor seals bobbing near the breakwater. Felix was holding Julian's hand, his small fingers wrapped tightly around Julian's thumb, humming a tuneless song under his breath. They were eating ice cream. They were laughing. They were, for the first time in Julian's life, a family. And someone was watching them from behind a stack of shipping containers with a telephoto lens. By the time Julian dropped the boys off at Sienna's cottage that evening, his phone was vibrating so violently it nearly rattled off the dashboard. Marcus, his head of public relations, was calling for the 11th time. Julian finally answered. "Julian, we have a problem," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "There is a photograph circulating on every social media platform in the country. You, 2 small children, and a woman who is decidedly not Cordelia Sterling, standing on the old harbor docks eating ice cream. The Seattle Times has already picked it up. The headline reads, 'Maritime Mogul's Secret Dockside Love Nest. I need a statement within the hour.'" Julian closed his eyes. "Is Cordelia aware?" She posted a statement on Instagram 20 minutes ago denying any knowledge of the children and expressing her heartbreak at your betrayal. She is playing the victim, Julian, and she is very, very good at it. When Julian arrived at the cottage, Sienna was already waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her face pale with fury. 2 news vans were parked at the end of the street. A reporter with a microphone was trying to interview a confused fisherman near the bait shop. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Sienna said before Julian could even open his mouth. Her voice was shaking, not with sadness, but with the kind of rage that comes from watching your worst nightmare unfold in real time. "They cannot even go to school without cameras in their faces now." Arthur came home crying because a woman shoved a microphone in his face and asked him if his daddy was a billionaire. "He is 5 years old, Julian. He does not even know what that word means. Sienna, I am handling it. I have already told Marcus to issue a statement requesting privacy." "Privacy?" Sienna laughed, and it was the most bitter sound Julian had ever heard. "You think a press statement is going to stop this? Your world does not respect privacy, Julian. It devours it. And now my children are on the menu." She pulled a crumpled envelope from her back pocket and held it up. "I got a job offer in Anchorage. It pays better than all 3 of my current jobs combined. The boys could have a normal life there. No cameras, no tabloids, no billionaires showing up on their doorstep and turning their world upside down." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "You cannot take them to Alaska." "Watch me," Sienna said, and the cold determination in her eyes told him she was not bluffing. The walls were closing in on Julian from every direction. The board wanted him out. The press wanted a scandal. And the woman he loved was 1 step away from disappearing forever with the only 2 people on this earth who made his life worth living. If you are on the edge of your seat right now, smash that like button and tell me in the comments, do you think Julian can save his family before it is too late? Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The following morning, the storm arrived. It came in from the Gulf of Alaska like a living thing, a massive, churning wall of black clouds and 50-knot winds that turned the normally calm waters of Puget Sound into a cauldron of white-capped fury. The meteorologists called it a once-in-a-decade gale. The old fishermen at the docks called it something worse. They called it a widowmaker. Rain hammered the glass walls of the Vance Maritime Tower in downtown Seattle with such force that the windows flexed inward. Inside the executive conference room on the 42nd floor, 12 members of the board of directors sat around a polished mahogany table, their faces illuminated by the sickly blue glow of their laptops. The mood was funereal. Julian sat at the head of the table, his phone resting face down beside a stack of legal documents. He had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Across from him, Derek Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair with the smug, patient expression of a man who knew he had already won. "The Singapore Green Fleet Consortium has issued a final deadline," Derek announced, sliding a document across the table. "Midnight tonight. If you sign the merger agreement and commit to relocating primary operations to Asia for 6 months, the deal goes through, and the board retains confidence in your leadership. If you refuse, the board will invoke the no-confidence clause in your contract and strip you of the CEO title by tomorrow morning." Julian stared at the document. $5 billion, 15 years of his life. His grandfather's legacy, reduced to a signature on a piece of paper. "And the relocation clause?" Julian asked quietly. 6 months in Singapore minimum," Derek replied smoothly. "You would need to leave by the end of the week. The consortium requires your physical presence to finalize the operational integration. 6 months. Julian thought of Arthur's nightmares. 3 taps on the headboard. Felix's ear infections, strawberry jam. The school pickup at 10 minutes to 2. If you are late, Arthur starts biting his fingernails until they bleed. "I cannot leave for 6 months, Julian said. The room erupted. Walter Harrington, the lead investor, slammed his palm on the table. "This is precisely the kind of erratic behavior that has the entire market questioning your stability, Julian. You have missed 6 key meetings in the past month. Your stock price has dropped 12% since that photograph hit the press. And now you are telling us you cannot honor a contractual obligation because of a personal situation that you created?" "They are my children," Julian said, his voice low and steady despite the fury building behind his ribs. "They are a distraction," Walter shot back, "and right now this company cannot afford distractions." Derek raised a hand, silencing the room with the effortless authority of a man who had been pulling strings from the shadows for decades. "Let us be reasonable, Julian. No one is asking you to abandon your family permanently. Sign the deal. Go to Singapore. Come back in 6 months. The children will still be here. Their mother seems perfectly capable of raising them alone. She has been doing it for 5 years after all." The word alone hung in the air like poison. Julian's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He thought of Sienna's exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes, the 3 jobs she worked just to keep the lights on and food in her children's mouths. The night she spent alone in a freezing cottage, listening to the ocean roar outside, wondering if she would survive another day. And this man, this smug, comfortable parasite who had forged the email that stole 6 years of Julian's life, was calling her capability a convenience. Julian's phone buzzed against the mahogany. He glanced down. It was Sienna. He almost ignored it, knowing he was in the middle of the most important meeting of his career. But something in his gut twisted, a primal instinct that overrode every corporate protocol he had ever learned. He flipped the phone over and read the text. "Julian, it is Felix. His fever spiked to 105. His throat is closing. The doctor says it is severe croup with respiratory failure. The harbor road is washed out by the storm surge. The clinic just lost power. They cannot intubate him without electricity. He is turning blue, Julian. I do not know what to do." The room went silent. The board members stared at Julian as the color drained from his face like water through a sieve. He stood up so abruptly that his heavy leather chair crashed backward against the glass wall, sending a spiderweb crack across the pane. "Julian," Derek said, his voice sharpening with alarm. "What are you doing?" "The satellite link to Singapore connects in 4 minutes." Julian did not hear him. He was already moving, grabbing his coat from the back of the chair, his mind locked onto a single image. Felix's small face, Felix's labored breathing, Felix's amber-flecked eyes looking up at him from the wet clover on the lawn, asking if he had 50 dogs. "My son is dying," Julian said, his voice cutting through the boardroom like a blade. Derek stood up, his composure cracking for the first time. "Julian, be reasonable. The consortium deadline is midnight. If you walk out of this room, the deal collapses. The board will vote you out before the hour is up. You will lose everything." Julian stopped at the door. He turned back to face the 12 men and women who had controlled his life for 15 years. He looked at the polished mahogany table, the glass walls, the panoramic view of the storm-lashed city below. He thought of his grandfather, who had built this company from a single fishing boat and a dream. He thought of his father, who had died believing Julian would carry the legacy forward. And he thought of Felix, 5 years old, suffocating in a darkened clinic less than 10 miles away while his father sat in a boardroom arguing about stock prices. Julian reached up and unpinned the Platinum Vance Maritime badge from his lapel. He walked back to the table and placed it gently on top of the $5 billion contract. "Vote me out," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. "What?" Derek whispered, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. "You heard me," Julian said, his voice steady and clear and utterly without fear. "Vote me out. Liquidate the shares. Take the building. Take the name. I do not care. My son needs me, and I am done choosing this room over my family." He turned and walked out the door. Behind him he heard Derek shouting, heard the board erupting into chaos, heard the sound of his empire crumbling in real time. But none of it mattered. None of it had ever mattered. And as Julian sprinted down the 42 flights of stairs to the parking garage, his heart pounding in his chest, he felt something he had not felt in 15 years. He felt free. Julian did not take a car. The mountain highway to Old Harbor was blocked by mudslides and the coastal road was submerged under 3 feet of storm surge. Every bridge between Seattle and the harbor was closed. There was only one way across, and it was suicidal. He ran to the private marina at the base of the financial district and jumped aboard his company's experimental search and rescue cutter, a vessel he had engineered himself during a sleepless weekend 3 years ago. The twin diesel engines roared to life with a thunderous growl that shook the dock. Julian threw the mooring lines, climbed into the helm station, and pushed the throttle to maximum. The crossing through Puget Sound in the middle of a 60-knot squall was the most terrifying experience of Julian Vance's life. Giant black swells, 20 feet tall and crested with white foam, crashed over the bow with the force of freight trains. Spray blinded him in horizontal sheets. The radar screen flashed red with gale warnings and collision alerts. The hull groaned and shuddered with every impact, the fiberglass flexing under the relentless assault of the sea. Julian gripped the helm with both hands, his knuckles white, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the compass heading that would take him to Old Harbor. The wind screamed through the rigging like a chorus of the damned. Rain hammered the windshield so hard he could barely see the bow of his own vessel. Every instinct in his body told him to turn back, to find shelter, to wait out the storm. But every time he blinked, he saw Felix's face. He saw the small hand reaching for his. He heard the quiet voice asking, Do you live in that big house all by yourself?" "Hold on, Felix," Julian whispered into the howling dark, his voice swallowed instantly by the wind. "Daddy is coming. I am not losing you. Not now. Not ever. The crossing should have taken 40 minutes. It took 63. 63 minutes of pure, unadulterated terror, during which Julian Vance, the man who had never prayed in his adult life, spoke to God with a desperation that would have shocked everyone who knew him. He promised everything. He promised the company, the money, the legacy, the name. He promised to give it all away, if Felix would just keep breathing. Just keep breathing. When the lights of Old Harbor finally flickered into view through the rain, they looked like dying candles in a cathedral of darkness. Half the town was underwater. The storm surge had swallowed the lower docks entirely, and the few buildings still standing were battered and dark, their windows blown out by the wind. Julian slammed the cutter into the remains of the public pier with a groan of fiberglass and timber. He grabbed the portable emergency generator and the pediatric ventilator kit from the cutter's medical locker, kicked open the hatch, and ran through knee-deep seawater toward the community clinic on the hill. The clinic was a small single-story building at the edge of town, and it was completely dark. The only light came from a single flashlight beam moving frantically behind the windows. Julian kicked the front door open and burst inside, dripping seawater onto the linoleum floor. The scene that greeted him would haunt him for the rest of his life. The examination room was illuminated by the pale, shaking beam of a battery-powered lantern. Sienna was kneeling on the floor beside a metal examination table, clutching Felix's limp, burning hand against her chest, her face wet with tears and rain. Her lips were moving in a silent, desperate prayer. The village doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Okonkwo, was frantically pumping a manual bag valve mask over Felix's face, his brow furrowed in concentration, his arms trembling from exhaustion. The heart monitor was dark. The oxygen tanks were empty. The power had been out for over an hour. In the corner of the room, 5-year-old Arthur was curled in a plastic chair, his knees pulled to his chest, biting his fingernails until they bled. His eyes were wide with a terror that no child should ever have to know. He was staring at his brother's still pale face and trying desperately not to cry. "Julian!" Sienna gasped when she saw him, her voice breaking into a sob of pure, overwhelming relief. Julian did not waste a single second. He dropped the generator on the floor and ripped the pull cord. The engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life, filling the room with the smell of diesel and the blessed hum of electricity. The clinical monitors flickered on. The overhead lights buzzed back to life, flooding the room with harsh, fluorescent brilliance. "Doctor, hook the ventilator to the medical port on the wall," Julian commanded, his voice steady and powerful, taking control of the room with the instincts of a man born to lead through crises. "I will manage the generator. You focus on the airway." Dr. Okonkwo nodded, his hands moving with renewed urgency as he connected the pediatric ventilator to the newly restored oxygen supply. Within 90 seconds, the machine was running, its rhythmic hiss filling the room as it gently, steadily forced life into Felix's struggling lungs. The oxygen saturation monitor climbed from a terrifying 72% to 85, then 90, then 94. Dr. Okonkwo let out a long, shuddering sigh and lowered the bag valve mask. "His airway is opening," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The swelling is responding to the epinephrine mist. His color is coming back. He is going to be okay. He is stable." Sienna collapsed against Julian's chest, her entire body shaking with violent, racking sobs. She buried her face in his rain-soaked flannel shirt, her fingers clutching the fabric as though he were the only solid thing left in a world that had been trying to drown her for 6 years. Julian wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her auburn hair, his own tears finally escaping and running down his stubbled cheeks. "I have got you," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. "I have got both of you. I am not going anywhere, I swear it. I swear it on everything I am." Across the room, Arthur looked up from his chair. His small, tear-streaked face was a portrait of disbelief and desperate hope. Julian extended his right arm without letting go of Sienna. Arthur slipped off the chair, ran across the room, and threw his small arms around Julian's neck, burying his face in his father's shoulder with a sob that shook his entire tiny body. Julian held his family in the harsh fluorescent light of the storm-battered clinic, feeling the steady, fragile rhythm of 3 hearts beating against his own. The generator hummed, the ventilator hissed. The storm raged outside, but inside that small, cold room on the edge of the world, Julian Vance was, for the first time in 36 years, completely and undeniably wealthy. If this moment gave you chills, I want you to do something right now. Subscribe to Billionaire Love Stories with Mr. Brad and share this video with someone you love, someone you would cross a storm for, and leave a comment telling me, who is your Felix? Who is the person you would give up everything for? Your answer might just remind someone else what truly matters. Stay with me for the final chapter, because the resolution of this story is going to leave you with a lesson you will carry for the rest of your life. Dawn broke over the harbor the next morning like a benediction. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sky of impossible washed-out blue and a coastline strewn with driftwood and kelp. The air smelled of salt and pine and survival. Inside the clinic, Felix was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady and strong, his small chest rising and falling beneath a wool blanket that Sienna had brought from home. The color had returned to his cheeks. The terrifying blue tinge around his lips was gone. He looked, for the first time in 2 days, like a normal, healthy 5-year-old boy who had simply worn himself out playing too hard. Arthur was curled in Julian's lap in the corner chair, his thumb in his mouth, his dark curls damp with sweat. He had refused to leave Julian's side since the moment he had run across the room the night before. Every few minutes, even in sleep, his small hand would reach up and grip Julian's shirt, as though confirming that his father was still there, still real, still not going to disappear. Sienna rested her head on Julian's shoulder, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even. She had not slept in 48 hours, but for the first time in 6 years she was not carrying the weight of the world alone, and the relief of that was so profound it had physically changed the lines of her face, softening the tension around her eyes, smoothing the crease between her brows. Julian sat perfectly still, unwilling to move a single muscle if it meant disturbing the fragile miracle in his arms. He looked down at his sons, then at Sienna, then out the window at the calm, glittering water of the harbor, and he made a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours ago. He picked up his phone and dialed Marcus. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I need you to file the paperwork. I am stepping down as CEO of Vance Maritime, effective immediately." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Julian, are you sure? The board is in chaos. Derek is trying to seize control. The consortium deal is dead. The stock is in free fall. If you leave now, you walk away with almost nothing." "I know," Julian said, "and I have never been more certain of anything in my life." 6 months later, the spring sun broke warm and golden over the hills of Old Harbor, and the world looked entirely different. The corporate towers of Seattle had survived without Julian Vance, though not without scars. Derek Caldwell's Singapore merger had collapsed within 90 days due to his own catastrophic mismanagement, and the board had fractured into a bitter web of litigation and recrimination. The stock price plummeted. The consortium partners walked away. Derek was eventually forced out by the remaining shareholders, his reputation in ruins, his career over. The empire he had tried to steal crumbled under the weight of his own greed, proving once and for all that legacies built on deception always collapse from the inside out. Julian walked away from the wreckage with his grandfather's original maritime patents and a modest severance package that was a fraction of his former net worth. He used the patents to launch a small, sustainable cooperative shipyard right in the harbor of Old Harbor, employing 40 local boat builders, fishermen, and marine researchers. It was not a billion-dollar enterprise. It did not make the cover of any magazines, but it was honest, it was real, and it allowed him to be home every single evening before the sun went down. On the bluff overlooking the bay, the old glass mansion at Heron's Point had been sold to a marine conservation trust. Cordelia Sterling had faded from the public eye after a humiliating interview on a morning talk show where she tried to paint herself as the victim of Julian's abandonment. The public saw through the performance. Her family's influence waned, the engagement ring was returned, the wedding was canceled, and the glass fortress on the hill, once a monument to Julian's ambition, was converted into a research center for endangered orca populations. The irony was not lost on anyone. Half a mile down the shore from the old estate, nestled among the cedar trees and wild blackberry bushes, stood a sprawling 2-story cedar house with wide porches, a bustling garden, and large windows that let in the sound of the tide. It was not perfect. The floors creaked. The roof leaked in one corner when the rain came in from the east. The kitchen was too small and the stairs were too steep, but it was warm, and it was loud, and it was alive in a way that the glass mansion had never been. In the backyard, where wild clover, sweet sorrel, and sea lavender bloomed in vibrant abundance, 2 6-year-old boys were kicking a soccer ball through the grass, their shouts of laughter echoing across the water. "Arthur, pass it!" Felix shouted, his cheeks flushed with healthy, radiant color as he dodged his brother with surprising agility for a boy who had nearly died 6 months earlier. Arthur grinned, wound up his leg, and sent the ball sailing over Felix's head and straight into the rose bushes. Both boys erupted into peals of laughter and dove into the bushes to retrieve it, their dark curls disappearing into the green foliage. Julian stood on the back porch, wearing a pair of worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. He looked nothing like the man who had stood on the terrace of Heron's Point in a $12,000 suit, adjusting platinum cufflinks and preparing for a magazine cover shoot. His hair was longer, his face more weathered, his hands rougher from months of working in the shipyard. But his eyes were different too. The cold, calculating stillness that had once defined them was gone, replaced by a warmth and depth that made him look 10 years younger and 100 years wiser. Sienna stepped out behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, resting her chin against his shoulder. Her eyes were bright, the dark shadows of exhaustion permanently erased, replaced by a deep, serene joy that radiated from her entire being. She smelled of salt air and cinnamon and the lavender soap she used to wash the boy's hair. "They are going to track mud all over your new hardwood floors," Sienna murmured with a soft laugh, nodding toward the boys who had abandoned the soccer ball and were now rolling through a puddle of rainwater with absolute, unbridled delight. "Let them," Julian said, setting the mugs on the cedar railing. "A house that is too quiet forgets how to laugh." Sienna smiled and reached up to touch the leather cord around his neck. Beside his old pocket knife, Julian now wore a matching cedar pendant, freshly carved, with new coordinates etched into the grain. The numbers pointed to this very porch, this very spot, this very moment. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her amber-flecked eyes searching his. "The empire? The $5 billion deals? The private jet? The magazine covers?" Julian looked past her, out to where his 2 sons were tumbling over each other in the clover, laughing until their sides ached, looking up at the sky with their father's eyes, their grandfather's eyes, eyes that carried the weight of 2 centuries of ocean and storm and survival. He pulled Sienna against his heart, feeling the warm Pacific breeze wrap around them like a promise that would never be broken. "I did not lose an empire, Sienna," Julian whispered, pressing his lips to her forehead. "I finally found one." And that, my friends, is the truth that Julian Vance learned the hard way. We spend our lives chasing titles, bank accounts, and the approval of people who would forget our names the moment we stopped being useful. We build glass fortresses and fill them with expensive things and wonder why we feel so empty inside. We choose ambition over love, power over presence, and legacy over life, and we tell ourselves we will make it up to the people we hurt someday. But someday is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the pain of choosing differently today. The real wealth, the only wealth that survives the storm, is the sound of your children laughing in a garden you planted with your own hands. It is the weight of a sleeping child in your arms at 3 in the morning. It is the look in the eyes of the person you love when they finally believe that you are not going to leave. It is the 3 taps on the headboard that tell a frightened little boy the floor is solid and the world is safe, and his father is right there in the dark, keeping watch. Julian Vance had $40 million and a glass house on a hill, and he was the poorest man on the coast. He lost it all in a single night, and he became the richest man alive. If this story touched your heart, I want you to do 3 things right now. First, share this video with someone you love, someone who needs to be reminded that they are more important than any job, any title, any bank account. Second, subscribe to Billionaire Love Stories with Mr. Brad, because we tell stories that matter. Stories that remind us what it means to be human in a world that tries to convince us that we are only worth what we produce. And third, leave a comment below telling me the most important lesson you took from Julian's journey. I read every single comment, and your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Remember, the greatest investment you will ever make is not in stocks or real estate or cryptocurrency. It is in the people who call you Dad, Mom, I love you. It is in the small, quiet moments that no camera will ever capture and no magazine will ever feature. It is in the courage to walk away from the boardroom when the storm comes and cross the darkest water to reach the ones who need you most. Until next time, take care of each other. Choose love over legacy. Choose presence over power. And never, ever let anyone convince you that the people you love are a complication you cannot afford. This has been Mr. Brad,